Hello, welcome to the Cultural and Historical Studies Hub here at London College of Fashion. It's our last one of the term, but we're delighted to be going out with such an exciting evening. It's our great pleasure, Pamela, who co-chairs the Hub, is here, and this is a joint effort with the Centre for Fashion Curation, and we're delighted to welcome Ingrid Mida, who is going to talk about her book, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. I brought an example copy. Ingrid is a curator and dress historian. She's the Fashion Research Collection Coordinator at Ryerson University. She also describes herself as an artist, art historian, author and photographer, terms that she likes to use, that bring together her personal interest in dress and the way in which you might look at dress and use that historically. She's written on history of fashion, and she's currently doing a PhD in fashion and art, which if it's as exciting as this book, then we look forward to that coming out. And tonight, Ingrid's going to talk to us about the process of writing The Dress Detective. I'd just like to say afterwards, there will be, we'll move from here into the canteen just across the hallway, and there will be drinks and an opportunity to celebrate the launch of the book, and for those who are interested to buy a copy, and I'm sure Ingrid will very kindly sign any copies if people are interested. So, Ingrid.
Thank you so much for coming today. I really do find it quite an honor and privilege to be here. And I don't normally read from notes, but since I'm on a different time zone, I apologize for reading my presentation to you today. It was with great eloquence that Susan Peirce wrote, "Objects hang before the eyes of the imagination, continuously representing ourselves to ourselves and telling the stories of our lives in ways that would be impossible otherwise. For me, every dress has a story that can be unpicked, whether it is the story of the designer, the maker, the person that wore the garment, or the person who chooses to donate it to a museum or study collection. The story of how I came to write The Dress Detective is intimately related to my work at Ryerson to recollect the Fashion Research Collection. It is also a tale of serendipity and happenstance. The story begins in the fall of 2011 when I heard a rumor that there was a study collection at the Ryerson University in Toronto. Someone said it was in the library, but no one seemed to know what was in it, who ran it, or how to access it. I was busy with other research and did not give that rumor much thought at the time, at least not until the afternoon of Friday, February 10th, 2012. That was the day when Dr. Alison Matthews-David, an associate professor in the School of Fashion at Ryerson, opened this unmarked door for me on the 7th floor of the library. Inside this small room, I encountered racks and racks of clothing, boxes piled in every nook, as well as bags and bins on the floor. It was like walking into the attic of an abandoned house. It was layered with dust and had a distinctly musty smell. Although most people would have been utterly repelled by this mess, to me it represented opportunity. Here was a collection of artifacts, in a sorry state to be sure, but it just might be worth saving. Although the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto has over 50,000 objects in its dress and textile collection and is located only a short distance away from the university, this museum collection is not accessible to Ryerson students. This had not always been the case. In the early years of the School of Fashion, illustration classes were held at the museum, and faculty and students were allowed relatively easy access to the ROM's extensive dress collection. However, after funding cutbacks at the ROM substantially reduced the number of curators in the department, this type of open access was no longer possible for Ryerson students or faculty. Many designers, Christabel Balenciaga, Christian Dior, and Alexandra McQueen, have visited archives and museum collections for inspiration, reinterpreting the past for the present. I'm sure I'm speaking to the converted when I say that seeing a dress in a photo is a very different experience from feeling the weight of the fabric in hand, examining the details of cut, construction, and embellishment, or considering the relationship of the garment to the body, or searching for how the garment was worn, used, or altered over time. Jules David Prown put it this way, quote, "Artifacts are primary data for the study of material culture, and therefore they can be used actively as evidence rather than passively as illustrations." Many of the leading fashion programs in North America had study collections to which students, faculty, and visiting scholars have access or can make appointments to examine historic and contemporary artifacts. The size and focus of these collections varies widely. The School of the Art Institute at Chicago, which is shown in these photos, has a tightly focused collection of 500 artifacts which illustrate advanced design and construction from 1950 onwards. At the other end of the spectrum, Kent State University Museum in Ohio has 5 exhibition galleries and 30,000 items that represent fashion from 1750 to today. Some collections include textiles, while others do not, and each varies in the manner in which students can engage with the collection. I aim to emulate and implement the best practices of other study collections. At Ryerson, instructors in the School of Fashion had been using garments, textile samples, books of laces, patterns, drawings, historic dolls and period costume, fashion magazines, and other items in the classroom since 1948, when the fashion department was first set up. It was in 1981 that a formal collection was created by instructor Kathy Cleaver, and for the first 10 years, paper records were meticulously kept. Over time, the fashion research collection grew by donation to several thousand items. Around 2005, Kathy Cleaver became semi-retired, and by 2009, the collection was effectively abandoned. By the time I took on the project in 2012, the collection was a mess, and the computer database had become unusable. Paper records after 1991 were scant or non-existent. Many of the items stored in the room had never been properly accessioned into the records, while other garments that were in the records, like a bloomer costume, had gone missing and were never found. In editing the collection, I systematically examined each and every object in the room, moving through racks, bins, and boxes one by one. That was when I became the dress detective. Since the paper records were minimal, I had to rely on my own judgment to date and ascertain the merit of each item. Although many garments were stored on padded hangers or in inert metal containers, many others had been stuffed into non-archival boxes, bags, or bins. Each container was a surprise, and the outer markings often give no hint as to what might be inside. For example, a produce box for lettuce was found to contain a very valuable Balmain ball gown from 1959 called Marie Antoinette. It did not take me long to discover a substantial number of designer labels, as well as some relatively obscure but important Canadian labels. It was then that I knew that there was a core of important artifacts worthy of collection. But some of it was frankly not worth my time to catalog, given that the passive collection policy had allowed almost anything offered to be accepted into the collection, including swim flippers, worn-out gym clothing, and moth-eaten coats. To recollect means to recall to mind or to remember. A study collection, like a museum, is both a storehouse and a repository of memory, and collective memory is derived from the relationship of the objects to each other through the act of selection by the curator in creating the collection. My intent was to rediscover and remember what is important in this collection, and in the process of doing so, refocus and rebuild the collection for the future. The museum has been described as both a burial chamber of the past, with all that it entails in terms of decay, erosion, forgetting, and as a site of possible resurrections. Although the Fashion Research Collection at Ryerson is not a museum, the collection of historic artifacts therein marks it as a site of memory. The objects that had been collected to that point in the collection represented a shared memory of what donors felt was important to save and to remember. Given the passive collections policy, the accumulated items in the collection would have reflected the attitudes and interests of the donors, most of whom were female. This group of donors chose to save women's special occasion dress. Many of the items in the collection were evening or bridal wear, as emblems of emotional ties that such clothing can have for the wearer, who often desires to prolong the biography of that garment. In curating this collection, I was entrusted with the shaping and organization of the material therein. After I disposed of garments that were moth-infested, posed health risks, or damaged beyond repair, I made my selections to support the objectives of the School of Fashion, which include heritage, diversity, and innovation. There were a significant percentage of contemporary items in the collection that were homemade or without labels. In the course of this project, many of those items were marked for deaccession, unless they were dated prior to 1950 or were representative of a particular construction technique taught in the design program at Ryerson. The preservation of heritage is important in terms of including garments that document Canadian fashion history. While the collection includes garments that illustrate the significant shifts in women's fashionable dress in Toronto from the 19th and 20th century, there were some marked gaps. For example, there was almost a complete absence of period corsets and crinolines, items that are often requested by students. As well, prominent Canadian designers like Dean and Dan Caden or Erdem, as well as Ryerson graduates Jeremy Liang or Tu Lee, were not represented, and menswear items were significantly underrepresented. I used my knowledge of Canadian fashion history in choosing artifacts that represented Toronto retailers that no longer exist, such as Simpsons, Eaton's, Creed's, and Canadian designers that had passed away like Maggie Reeves or had retired, such as Marilyn Brooks. And while these items might not be as valuable as a couture label, they have significance as objects with a distinctly Canadian identity. One of the most unusual sets of artifacts that I found in an unmarked shoebox on the floor was a group of carte de visite and cabinet cards donated by a single collector. This rare set of photographs depicts Canadians photographed in studios from Toronto and other Ontario towns. These historic photographs offer specific visual references to see how garments in the Ryerson collection might have been worn or accessorized in the past. Canada has a populace made up of diverse cultures, and most of what was collected to that point represents Western dress. An effort to collect garments from Aboriginal peoples and other cultures has been made to give students the opportunity to examine and be inspired by the techniques of construction, embellishment, and design of other cultures. These rare 1930s pajamas, Chinese pajamas, were acquired in 2013, and I've since received donations of kimono, Moroccan wedding dress, as well as Chinese textiles and robes that date back to the 19th century. Innovation is conveyed through the collection of garments with inventive construction techniques or design, like this slashed leather dress by Ryerson grad Yvonne Lin. But much of what is in the collection is conservative in styling and construction and would not be considered innovative. This is a directive for future acquisitions. From the beginning, I knew that the challenge would be to gain support, both financial and collegial, for this collection. There was a reason this resource had been left unused all those years. My status as a contract staff member was, and frankly continues to be, tenuous at best, and in the face of budgetary pressures, I knew that the long-term viability of a university collection would demand that the collection be actively used. I could not wait for students or faculty to find me. I had to go out and find them. And so very early on, even when the collection was barely accessible and I was uncertain as to its viability beyond the end of my contract, I began to visit classes and talk about object-based research. My aim was to be the antithesis of the cranky curator, and I wanted to invite students to use the collections for their research. I would often begin my talks with this beautiful quote from Christian Dior: "We invent nothing. We always start from something that has come before." In terms of discussing methodology with students, I would reference the seminal article on material culture written by Jules David Brown called Mind and Matter, an introduction to material culture theory and method. I would methodically work through the article, reviewing in detail his 3 key steps of description, deduction, and speculation. In spite of my best efforts, I found that many students would produce accurate descriptions of the garment or accessory, but seemed unable to go beyond that and ended their analysis at speculation, with, as what Valerie Steele described as, a string of unanswered questions. It did not seem to matter how much time or care I took to reinterpret Brown for them. The analysis was almost always superficial, and few of them had any idea how to relate their findings to theory. From my perspective, using Brown seemed to discourage students from using artifacts in their research process. And even though I am a photographer, another observation that I made was that students would often take a quick series of photos and think that they were done. Slowing down to look, to really look and interpret the evidence was not happening. As well, others seemed to be anxious or uncertain what to do besides taking photos. It struck me that there had to be a better way, and that is when the checklists were born. In creating checklists, I was writing down steps that I would do without thinking, but probably would not be obvious to someone who had not worked in a museum. For me, every dress tells a story, whether it's a story about the designer, the maker, or the person that wore it, and I wanted to help students accomplish that. Not long thereafter, in the fall of 2013, I met Emily Ardizoni of Bloomsbury. I was passing through London and extended a friendly invitation to Emily to go out for coffee. At that meeting, Emily asked me about what I was working on. At the end of our conversation, she suggested that I write a proposal for a book on how to do object-based research in fashion. I was pretty busy, and I promised Emily that I would think about it in due course. And then, one night, a few weeks later, the entire structure of the book came to me like a dream. I got up in the middle of the night and wrote the whole thing down. And not long thereafter, I decided to show the proposal to my friend Alexandra Kim, a former curator at Kensington Palace who had moved to Toronto. She liked it very much and encouraged me to go forward with it. Having not written a scholarly book before, and being a relative unknown in the UK, I thought it would be a good idea to ask her to be a co-author, and she signed on. I must publicly bow my hat to her for her willingness to take direction from me and generally put up with me. I'm a hardcore perfectionist, and I wanted the book to read as one voice and also to be as accessible to a range of audiences as it was possible. Even though The Dress Detective is an academic text, I wrote it so that anyone, scholar and layperson alike, could learn something. And I also tested the checklists on a young teenager who lives across the street, and we did a marvelous project together. But one question that Alexandra Kim wondered out loud was, how had I figured this out? The secret behind my ability to see what others often do not is in part because I studied art. I think that it is in learning to draw that one learns to see. And it was actually through art that I came to study costume history. When drawing, one is constantly having to establish relationships between parts. In figuring out the length of a ruffle on a shoe to the toe box, close attention is required. To draw with accuracy, one has to slow down and look, really look. And for me, time slows down when I draw, and that is the basis of my initial approach to studying artifacts. I call it the slow approach to seeing. I encourage researchers to draw, even if they do it badly. It slows down the process and helps to reveal the subtle details that take time to be uncovered. I also believe anyone can draw, and it's not about drawing, but rather about the looking. And if there isn't enough time to draw, committing to careful and systematic looking really makes a difference to the results. And I think those of you who are in my workshop this afternoon probably witnessed that firsthand. I also encourage drawing in the classes that I teach, and have even incorporated drawing exercises into courses like oral history and ethnography, where drawing wouldn't be an obvious choice of activity. I believe that drawing will tease out the story from an artifact. Let's dive into the book. The Dress Detective is the first practical guide to analyzing fashion objects, clearly demonstrating how their close analysis can enhance and enrich interdisciplinary research. The book outlines a skill set that has, until now, typically been passed on informally. The process of studying a dress artifact can be divided into three main phases, including Phase 1, observation, capturing the information from the dress artifact. Phase 2 is reflection, considering the embodied experience of engaging with the artifact to identify changes in cultural beliefs, uncover researcher bias, and locate contextual material. And Phase 3 is interpretation, linking the observations and reflections to theory. In other words, telling the story. The observation checklist in The Dress Detective is a way to systematically work through the analysis of a garment. There are 6 sections addressing aspects that are unique to dress artifacts, including construction details, textile characteristics, inclusion of labels, and elements of use and wear. There are 40 questions in total. The checklist begins with a general section that encourages a student to think broadly and take note of initial impressions before becoming overly concerned with the details. Then the idea is to methodically work through the questions of each section, with the most subtle and difficult parts of this detective work left closer to the end. Before the appointment is over, the checklist alerts the researcher to ask about other garments from the same donor or same designer, as well as request supporting material that may be available, such as provenance records or photos. Question 30 asks, is there a marking inside the garment that indicates the specific owner of the garment, such as an embroidered initial, name tag, or laundry mark? For example, this cotton petticoat from 1890 includes the embroidered signature of Elizabeth Hughes, created with a bold red thread that suggests a vibrant young woman. And she did that in all the petticoats and skirts that she owned. Where the need for slow looking is most critical is in examination of a garment for details of how it has been used and worn, which are questions 31 to 35. Question 31 asks, has the garment been structurally altered in any way? This 1860 dress has had an extra black silk panel added at the front of the bodice, and the waistband of the skirt has been unpicked. These are clues that the wearer was likely trying to accommodate an expanding figure due to pregnancy. It's in the reflection stage that I ask researchers to consider their sensory and personal reactions to the object, as well as their biases. The reflection checklist includes a list of 20 questions and is divided into 3 parts that address sensory reactions such as sight, touch, sound, and smell, emotional reactions, which are intended to unlock researcher bias, and contextual material. Although we might not be conscious of our personal and emotional involvement with the history of the object, it's there, implicitly coloring our observations and the results of our research, since each of us has a cultural stance that reflects the age in which we live in. Unconsciously, we make assumptions and judgments about class, gender, religion, politics, occupation, age, ethnicity, and sexuality during the course of our day. And in order to be objective in our research, we must acknowledge these assumptions and work to overcome our distortions and biases. In terms of contextual material, this series of questions is designed to encourage the researcher to seek out imagery, written text, and other objects that can be linked to the artifact in some way. Question 15 in the reflection checklist asks researchers to identify similar garments in other collections. Many museum collections are now online, and this step is relatively easy. A search for Dior garments on the collection portal at the Met revealed that the Dior ensemble on the right was from 1955. Given that the jacket on the left, which was found in the Ryerson collection, was made of the same fabric, a brown wool tweed, it is likely that this garment was also from that year and from that collection. Another example of looking for contextual material is trying to identify photographs, paintings, or illustrations of the garment. That's question 18. And while there's no direct links between this painting and this Castle Béjac tunic, you can see the similarities in the styling. Ideally, all donations would come with photos. This jaunty CN Tower uniform for elevator operators was found in the collection without provenance or label. I was very lucky when I posted a photo of the uniform on Twitter, which prompted the woman who once wore the uniform in the photo to send the newspaper clipping to me. And she is right in the middle of that image in the front row. Question 19 of the reflection checklist asks the researcher whether this garment or others like it has been referenced in documents such as letters or receipts, magazines or novels, or other forms of written material. This wedding slipper is one of the few artifacts in the Ryerson collection that was accompanied by a letter from the donor. The letter, which I've extracted on the slide, revealed that the shoes were worn to the wedding of Miss Mary Lawson to Mr. Edward Dowling, a telegraph operator, in 1889 or 1890. Interpretation is the process by which a researcher links together all the evidence gathered during the other phases of research and creates an analysis as to its meaning. As one of the most challenging steps of the object-based research process, it's difficult to articulate the course of action definitively, since the goals of each researcher are different, and for that reason, this section does not include any checklists. This stage of the process is both imaginative and highly creative, requiring the researcher to assimilate the knowledge gathered in other phases of the process, to find patterns, to make conjectures, and draw conclusions. Dress artifacts are complex composites of material and cultural values. Reading a dress is like reading a painting. Both can be undertaken with precision, but the interpretation is subjective. Ultimately, the researcher must be creative, but also rigorous in interpreting results. The Dress Detective includes 7 case studies that offer examples of how evidence from a garment can be used to unlock the narratives and cultural beliefs that are embodied in the dress artifact. The 7 garments were selected to include a representative sample of fashionable Western dress that might be available to fashion scholars, as well as to address a variety of research questions. These objects were sourced from private collections as well as the Ryerson collection. This beautiful yellow wool pelisse with a lilac silk lining is dated to about 1820 and comes from a private collection in the UK. There were no details about the original wearer, but the garment can be used to consider the identity of the person that wore it. Since it's handmade, it can also be used to discuss the production of fashionable garments prior to the invention of the sewing machine. And it can be linked to similar garments seen in fashion plates of the time to consider the dissemination of fashion in the early 19th century. And it was our objective in writing these case studies that we showed a range of interpretations for each object so that there was no definitive right answer. One of the artifacts that's most often requested in research appointments is the corset. This undergarment is considered one of the most controversial objects in fashion history and is a continued source of fascination and inspiration. Although this particular corset from a private collection is relatively plain, it featured a number of technological features that allowed greater ease in fastening and adjusting the corset, including the metal eyelets at the back and the slot and stud fastenings at the front. As a case study, it can be interpreted in a multitude of ways, some of which are shown above. Although most museum and study collections privilege the dress of the elite, examining working class dress also offers insight into the dissemination of fashion and dressmaking practices. This brown velveteen and wool bodice is modest but is stylish with its high tight collar and full sleeve heads that conform to the fashions of the 1890s. This bodice illustrates both complexity and care in its construction and could also be used to consider the realities of making and wearing fashionable dress by the working class as compared to the idealized version presented in women's fashions of the period. I just see everything's numbered 1 there. I'm not sure what happened with that. I guess it's all important. Menswear is often underrepresented in museum collections. This case study uses a men's tailcoat and trousers from the Ryerson collection that came without any provenance information. The tailcoat and trousers are made from fine black wool woven with a delicate stripe that have been dated to about 1912 to 1922. There is no surviving vest accompanying the suit. This ensemble offers a range of possibilities for interpretation. The very fine wool of the suit suggests that it was a bespoke suit, and as such could be used to consider how concepts of formality and class are expressed through the subtleties of men's clothing. The emotional poignancy associated with wedding dresses accounts for their very high survival rate in museum and study collections. However, in the case of this particular wedding dress and headpiece, someone did not know the significance of the Lanvin label, and the dress was altered in such a dramatic way that it was very difficult to date and authenticate the dress. The degree of alterations in this dress limited the range of interpretation somewhat, but it was the dress detective challenge that I enjoyed very much, as it involved visiting the storage facilities of the Musée Galliera to compare early Lanvin wedding dresses in their collection. My memories of the moment that I discovered this jacket in the Ryerson collection are still very vivid. It was hanging in a dark corner. In fact, it was so dark and hung so high that I was using touch to identify garments made with quality fabric. This jacket is made of the finest silk velvet and is so smooth and silky that I immediately knew it was special, and that was before I read the label. Who doesn't love Dior? This jacket literally made my heart flutter. Its distinctive pocket detail made it relatively easy to date, and then I found a stunning photo by Louise Dalwolf in Harper's Bazaar for September 1949, in which the model is wearing this jacket and matching pencil skirt. Sadly, Ryerson does not have the bone-thin pencil skirt that was designed to accompany the jacket, but there's still a range of possibilities for interpretation. The final case study in the book is of a jacket designed by Kenzo for fall-winter 2004. This jacket, with its wide, loose sleeves and unfitted shape, adopts elements of a kimono and uses a mixture of fabrics, which is a distinctive signature of the Kenzo label. This jacket, which is one of several hundred items that were donated to Ryerson by the family of the late Kathleen Kubash, offers the chance to interpret her sartorial choices. As well, the designer's eclectic mixing of fabrics and spirited blending of stylistic and cultural references could be used to illustrate the concept of postmodernity in fashion. What the dress detective aims to accomplish is to minimize the anxiety and confusion by articulating a systematic approach to examining dress artifacts. Since the book was published, I've also tested the checklists on costume artifacts such as a tutu, and it works equally as well. Next month, an article in the American journal Dress will document my dress detective analysis of a tutu dated to 1953 and worn in an obscure ballet by Anthony Tudor called Gala Performance. I'd like to go back to the Ryerson Fashion Research Collection and revisit that part of my story. It has been just over 4 years since that door in the library was opened to me. Besides editing the collection, I also supervised the renovation of space that was used to house the Image Arts Department, who have since moved into another building on campus. This rabbit warren of rooms, which covers 2,500 square feet, significantly adds to the amount of space that is available for research and storage. We were not allowed to remove walls due to the presence of asbestos in the ceiling, but the rooms have been made functional. These photos are the before shots. There are now an array of students across faculties that have used the collection in some way, including interior design, architecture, image arts, history, and museum studies. I aim to make those experiences fun and engaging, and in this photo you can see a couple of grad students try on reproduction crinolines. There's nothing like trying something on that forces you to walk or sit in a different way to understand how another culture or time influenced fashion. In 2014, I accepted over 600 pieces that filled many of the gaps in the collection, especially in terms of 19th century dress. The oldest dress in the collection now dates back to 1818. All of these items once belonged to Alan Sutton, a leading collector of historic dress in Toronto, whose sizable personal collection included many rare and valuable items of dress, including couture items by Balenciaga, Balmain, and Christian Dior. He died in 2001 at age 75. Alan Sutton's private collection was acquired by Kathy Cleaver, the instructor that had founded the collection at Ryerson. She and Alan Sutton had been friends for a long time. After Alan's death, Kathy purchased the collection for a nominal amount with the stated intent of giving it in its entirety to Ryerson. However, Kathy held on to Alan's collection for more than 12 years, shifting it between various storage locations until her daughter came to me in 2012 asking what should be done with it. With more than 6,000 pieces in varying states of decay, I knew I could not handle that size of donation myself, and the collection was broken up. That process, which I was intimately involved with, will be the subject of an upcoming article in Fashion Theory in the special issue on collections edited by Amy Delahaye. Although many of the garments that I would have liked to receive went to auction, our allotment included this beautiful black satin embroidered clutch coat with fur trim from the 1920s that bears the label Holt Renfrew & Co. by appointment of His Majesty King George V. In 2015, we had our first graduate student who focused her work on garments from the collection. Miriam Couturier submitted her master's research paper about the wardrobe of one of the donors to the collection, and that was Barbara Moon, a former journalist and magazine editor who in 1997 donated 62 couture and pret-a-porter garments. Couturier found that Moon's clothing choices were instrumental in shaping the image she projected and also served to define the way that she was remembered in local and national publishing circles. Although Moon's wardrobe included labels such as Dior, Balenciaga, Valentino, and Givenchy, her clothing shows distinct signs of wear and alterations. Couturier found that these donated pieces revealed Moon's decades-long engagement with and appreciation for high fashion. Moon's individual garments do not necessarily appear glamorous at first glance, although you might argue the other way with this particular Valentino gown. However, her wardrobe as a whole solidified her image as a fundamentally chic working woman. Couturier won several awards for this project. With access to the collection limited to 2 days a week, Masters of Fashion students at Ryerson are the key users. As I mentioned earlier, when I'm lecturing, I find a way to integrate the collection into my curriculum, even for a graduate seminar in oral history and ethnography, which I taught last term. This is my wonderful class. Another significant barrier to access is the fact that there's no online catalog. Each research request must be handled individually, and it often takes me several emails to try and coax out what a student's really after. I worked on a pilot project to put an online collection catalog using open source software called Omeka, and here you can see a screenshot of that beta site. It would have been ideal, but funding was pulled just before the public interface was created. So the collection catalog continues to exist in the form of an Excel spreadsheet. My main point of access to engage students and others interested in the collection is with Twitter and also a blog. I try to post short research essays that I write or that students write for me. Here you can see some of the post titles that are online so far, and more to come. There's also a Pinterest site, and I know I should be on Instagram, but frankly, it's very time-consuming to keep up with all the social media. I have engaged in community outreach with a variety of talks at different venues around Toronto, and of course, at scholarly conferences. Slowly, other museums have begun to ask for loans. This 1870s dress was one that I offered to the Bata Shoe Museum for the exhibition called Fashion Victims, co-curated by Ryerson University Associate Professor Alison Matthews-David. It was in the unpacking of the Sudden Cleaver collection that I recognized this distinctive green hue from Alison's research, and we tested it in the lab to confirm my hunch that it contained arsenic. It replaced a dress that had been borrowed from Australia for the first year of the exhibition. Besides the artifacts from Ryerson, or the articles about Ryerson included in The Dress Detective, some other publications have included images or essays about Ryerson objects. And occasionally I get a little bit of press to help the cause. I would like to close by saying that from my perspective, there's still enormous untapped potential in the Ryerson Fashion Research Collection, as I think there is here in the archive you have. This image shows a reconceptualization of the space at Ryerson by the Toronto architecture firm of ARC. The future of the Ryerson collection continues to hang in the balance, but I hold out hope that this important initiative will continue, even if it's someone other than me advancing the cause. Whatever happens, there is an endless amount of dress detective work to be done, and with any luck, perhaps the future will hold another book for me with Bloomsbury. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ingrid. We've got some time for questions before we let Ingrid have a glass of wine to recover. We are recording this, so if you have questions, if you could wait for the mic and just say who you are, just because it's always useful to know.
Is this all right? Oh, yeah. So you were saying with your Dior, the Dior red velvet jacket, that you felt sort of the fabric and it was an amazing fabric. Did you handle it with gloves on?
At that point, I wasn't handling anything with gloves because it was in that decrepit room, and beside the Dior was a ratty old jean jacket. So it was a matter of expediting finding those couture pieces and putting them in a safe place as quickly as possible. And actually, because it was so dark, there was no way for me to see what I was handling. So yes, I broke that rule of not touching it without gloves.
Yeah, just because I find it interesting, the whole sort of paradox of how you're encouraged to try and handle it and sort of feel the fabric, and you always do that through gloves or thick gloves, so you still, there's that barrier, you're still able to at least feel the weight, but you can't truly feel the fabric. And I just found that interesting with your case study of the Dior, that you managed to actually feel the tactile material. So
Yes, and that is such an interesting paradox with clothing, that it's such a sensual experience to handle beautiful textiles, and that's taken away from you. But curator means to care for. In Latin is the root of the word, and that means that I have an obligation to make sure that many students can handle it. So gloves are essential, yes, sadly.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Have you ever worked with a collection where you have access to the collector, and how, if you have, how does that inform your research, or how have you used that testimony? Or
Well, in this course that I taught last term for oral history and ethnography, I specifically approached people that had recently donated garments to Ryerson, so that there was more than one garment that could be talked about. And I think oral history is a wonderful way to capture those stories about a particular garment, or just the way someone shops or chose to save those things, perhaps the reason why they wanted to donate them. I do find, and it doesn't matter whether I'm recording it in oral history or not, but when I do go visit collectors, sometimes they don't have specific memories associated with a particular garment, but there's a reason they want to give it. And there is actually a kind of grieving process that they go through in deciding to give it up. And I do feel like I'm on, I'm a little bit like doing a show, a performance, to convince them that they can give me that garment and I will make sure it's taken care of. There is that element. But now that students have recorded this oral history testimony from these people, if there was a blog post that we did, looked at, or was on the list, a bed jacket by Mercy, which was the subject of a very famous lawsuit, got settled out of court. In 2009, Diana von Furstenberg ripped off these local designers, copied this jacket stitch for stitch. And one of our great fashion journalists had that jacket and broke that story. So now that's been captured for other people to use in perhaps a different way. But her other choices as well, of the other objects that she gave to the collection, were all very interesting, sort of eclectic Canadian fashion labels, and her commitment to Canada's very small fashion scene was quite evident. So it's really, I think, being a curator or picking, if you're responsible for collecting garments, there is always that sort of personal relationship that you have to develop with people, and so I'm sure that affects, that's my own personal story of these garments.
Okay, thank you.
You talked about the surprise you felt at finding some of the garments, and that's really quite unique and how exciting. Were you also surprised at the condition of some of the garments? Was handling difficult? Did you have to do something, first aid, remedial work?
Well, I did find the process very difficult, mostly because of the amount of dust in that room. And I did kind of make a deal with myself, because with that amount of objects in a room, it can be totally overwhelming. And I think that's what happened in those intervening years. Everyone knew it was there, and a lot of people knew that those wonderful labels were probably in there somewhere, but it was just so much stuff and in such a poor state that I would tell myself, okay, I'm just going to do this amount or this many bags or boxes. And I was appalled, and I did have to throw out things that I wish I didn't, because there were some sections that were moth infested. So as I was mentioning, Luke, when I was handling those pieces, I was looking, and touch is that way. You can tell a quality garment. You don't have to read the label. You can feel it. It was the fastest way for me to do that. So I did feel very sad in throwing out Yves Saint Laurent and whatever, but I had to protect the rest. And of course, there is that period in fashion history when silk was weighted, so there were lots of garments that were deteriorating quite substantially, that were just toxic, like health hazards. Every time they're handled, there's some metallic salts that are released, and I knew that wasn't safe for me, and it wasn't safe for anyone else either. So those were disposed of. Very sad.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the talk. It was great. I was interested when you said about getting students to draw to slow down the process and to be able to see differently. So then that almost seems to me, I was just quite interested in the idea that you used Prown as one of your deciphering techniques, and then you have drawing. I wondered if you've ever used making as a way of discovering about a garment, because I'm a maker, and I've tried to use Prown in assessing garments, and I discover that you end up missing out a lot because you're categorized into various areas that then make other deductions impossible because you've basically sidestepped them. And interesting that a lot of theories that I've read seem to look at a garment from top down rather than bottom up, which is what a person who is creating a garment would do. And I think you see a lot more as a maker than you do necessarily as an observer, and a drawing seems somewhere in the middle. So I don't know if you've considered that.
I am a maker myself, so I sit in that very kind of liminal space that I'm a scholar and a maker. I'm an artist and I'm a scholar, and that combination doesn't seem to, I've never met anyone else who quite works the same way. But Prown,
so now you've met
Prown is the person that I found problematic, and I didn't think it fit, so that's why the dress detective was born. The drawing part of it is, even if some people like to drape to make, I like to draw to make. So it depends on your process, but I created a course this past term which is on reproducing historic dress. And so they actually take a garment and have to replicate, and they learn through the making. So that works very well for that kind of student. But at the graduate level, there's equal numbers of makers and sort of scholars. So they don't want to have to make something. So this works for both, and it fits in that space that you can kind of adapt it to either style, whatever is your preferred way of learning. But I do like making, yes. Is that it? One more?
Hello. I just wanted to say on behalf of everyone at Bloomsbury that it's been a real pleasure to work with Ingrid, and I also just wanted to highlight another achievement that she hasn't mentioned, which is that she has won the very prestigious Janet Arnold Patterns of Fashion Award, which was based on the strength of her proposal alone. So yeah, just wanted to make sure everyone was aware of that. Another really great achievement for the dress detective.
Thank you. And that's the reason I'm here, is the Society of Antiquaries. I have to give that talk tomorrow to the fellows there. Is that all the questions? It was such a pleasure to talk to you. I apologize for reading. I wish I could just have had some objects and we could have had a fun time together. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. So if people have time and would like to, we can move across the corridor to the canteen. We can raise a glass to Ingrid's book and award. And for those of you who are interested, there will be copies of the book.
I don't know what happened to that PowerPoint with those numbers. That's so weird.
Did something happen?